History records that from earliest times, for each weapon of warfare man devised, he soon developed a method of defense. The introduction of gunpowder to Europe in the 13th century brought about a new concept of waging war, with new weapons. But again, man exercised his unique intelligence to develop means of defense. In World War I came the tank, seemingly invincible, until means to combat it were found. World War II also brought strategic bombing of industrial targets, with civilian populations under fire. It was then the neighborhood air raid warden appeared, a means of aiding in the defense of non-combatants. Meanwhile, the world had witnessed the introduction of new death-dealing weapons, the blockbuster and the V-bomb. But it remained for the closing days of World War II to introduce a weapon far surpassing anything the world had yet conceived in the magnitude of its destructive power. Consider the force of this destructive power. Blast and heat sufficient to destroy or severely damage property within a radius of more than 1 mile from the point of the burst. A single weapon that could result in thousands upon thousands of casualties. The advent of the A-bomb sent a wave of fear throughout the world. To many, it spelled the end of civilization. Where was a means of defense? Vulnerable were America's many areas of industrial concentration with their civilian populations. Indeed, even rural America could not escape the effects of an A-bomb attack. But in 1951, a system of civil defense was being organized throughout the major target areas of America. Soon it became clear such defense must be based at the grassroots of urban life, in the multitude of neighborhoods surrounding each industrial center, which in their total represent the city. In the pyramidal organization of civil defense, at its apex is the Civil Defense Director and his staff, then professional and technical specialists. Civil defense auxiliaries. In the zone, district, and block, wardens and their assistants. With neighborhood families comprising the broad base of civil defense organized under the leadership of their wardens in family survival activities. In this early period, the Air Force predicted as many as 70% of enemy bombers might reach the neighborhoods of our industrial centers. But our Air Continental Defense Command was busy. Additional radar defenses against surprise atomic attack were being constructed. This was the situation in late 1951 when John Foster, proprietor of a small neighborhood appliance store, assumed the role of warden of his block. A block protection system based on staying put in the neighborhood, of duck and cover in the event of A-bomb attack without warning, of taking shelter when warning time was sufficient. Meanwhile, in his rural community, a half-day's driving time from the city, Ed Fitzgerald, small-town merchant, was also alert to the need for civil defense, alert to the perils of biological warfare as a potential weapon against our animals and crops, alert to the possibility of his rural community serving as a reception center for thousands of refugees from the city, devastated by attack, seeking food and shelter. But with the safety that lies in distance, attempts to organize a civil defense program among his townspeople met only half-hearted response. Now, let John Foster, block warden in a major target area of America, tell you how he organized his neighborhood for civil defense.
Among our first jobs was building a block map, an inventory of all physical facilities in our neighborhood, buildings, frontages, power lines, hydrants, gas and sewer mains. A map that would tie in with all other block maps in our district. By making door-to-door calls, our warden team developed a block census, an inventory of all people on our block, including children, the aged, and the ill. To get the interest and cooperation of the people on our block, we stressed the importance of properly conducting a neighborhood meeting, one of many we held. Next, we took inventory of special problems on our block raised by schools, stores, and other commercial concerns. In short, those establishments not able to fully care for themselves in a time of emergency. Meanwhile, we were busy training our warden team and auxiliaries in survival activities. Neighborhood firefighting, light rescue techniques, and first aid, for example. We also trained our people in moving disaster victims to the welfare assembly area for medical aid. Meanwhile, we were busy in planning for receiving and billeting evacuees in time of disaster, in the event that our block was not damaged by the attack. Preparing a survey of neighborhood resources to determine how many evacuees we could feed and lodge. Of course, we stressed the need for one of various types of shelters for each family on the block to help ensure their survival. Also, the need for emergency sanitation measures, stored water and food, for emergency sewage and garbage disposal facilities.
And so in thousands of neighborhoods throughout urban America, civil defense wardens such as John Foster were active in helping to prepare their neighborhoods for a bomb attack, demonstrating again man's adaptability to adjust to a new and powerful weapon of attack by evolving a method of defense. In 1953 and 1954, the world was stunned by knowledge that a thermonuclear device had been developed, then exploded in an isolated area of the Pacific Ocean. A weapon which surpassed even the largest A-bomb in its destructive power, with an energy force in ranges of millions of tons of TNT equivalent. During the A-bomb era, the world had grown accustomed to the peril of immediate radiation effects within the area of the bomb burst. But the H-bomb introduced an even greater danger, residual radioactivity. In fact, the weapon exploded at Bikini Atoll in 1954, swept hundreds of tons of atomized materials up to an atmospheric level of 80,000 feet and above, able to be carried tremendous distances by prevailing winds. Indeed, here was sufficient radioactivity to seriously endanger all people caught in the downwind belt of this elliptical cigar-shaped cloud. Even greater problems will be created by the explosion of larger weapons. And so, added to more intensive blast, heat, and immediate radiation effects, the H-bomb became to our people in our cities, as well as in our rural areas, a symbol of potential danger to our way of life. Through the years, however, across the northern rim of our hemisphere, the Continental Air Defense Command had been busy building a radar network. Far out in our coastal waters, radar ships and towers were stationed to provide warning of surprise attack. And our ground observer corps is doing faithful duty, while within our borders, our jet interceptor strength had multiplied. Guided missiles such as Nike have been devised, all examples of the pattern throughout history of man's ability to counter new weapons that threaten his existence. Yes, these defenses plus another for the safety of the millions of our people in our great urban centers. Evacuation of our cities. Evacuation to escape the perils of blast, heat, and radioactive effects of the H-bomb. The logistical problems of evacuating our great metropolitan centers seemed enormous. But everywhere efforts were made by state, local, and civil defense officials to study these many problems, in spite of the occasional skeptic, the defeatist overawed by the difficulties of evacuation. In many of our cities, plans for evacuation and shelter of their civilian populations progressed. Evacuation exercises and shelter drills were conducted, and soon it became apparent that a key figure in this plan for family and individual survival was the neighborhood warden, stationed at the bedrock of community life, responsible for organizing and training residents of his block for survival and coordinating his neighborhood program into that of the district, the zone, and the city.
Though the block protection program was no longer based on simply staying put in the neighborhood, this did not mean the discard of organizational and training activities of the A-bomb era. Instead, a broad readjustment was necessary. We still had important use for the block map, the block census, techniques in conducting a neighborhood meeting, our survey of facilities and warden organization. Now we placed even more emphasis on first aid and home nursing training. Also, in radiation detection devices. Our wardens received training in evacuation plans for the block and adjacent areas, in shelter and survival methods. Meanwhile, I was busy drilling selected wardens in emergency duties such as traffic control, transportation pooling, front to rear communications, in what to do on the evacuation alert, especially floor wardens in multi-story buildings. Other wardens were being drilled in assisting the aged, the ill, and the handicapped during the evacuation process, while others were learning the use of the Geiger counter and other monitoring instruments for radiation detection. But all were being trained in the decontamination and emergency sanitation procedures prescribed by the Radiological Defense Forces. Since not as high a degree of skill is necessary among volunteers for evacuation, I made valuable use of untrained adults and teenagers. Meanwhile, to complete our program, there was another job: to train alternate wardens in first aid, home nursing, panic prevention and control, fire prevention, and simple rescue techniques.
But what of the neighborhood with a non-existent or weakened warden system? Here, with the aid of local groups, a warden must be selected. Until time for a more thorough job is available, a block map and block census must be quickly improvised. Each family on the block must be instructed through neighborhood meetings and individual home calls. Mrs. Henry Coleman is such a newly appointed warden. With her assistant, she calls on each and every one of her neighbors.
There is no substitute for home calls, talking individually with each family about the urgency of evacuation as the family's best protection from H-bomb attack. With each family, I left Conelrad stickers for their radio. Also, a movement route card showing the evacuation route to be taken. It was also my job to see that every member of our block had some means of transportation. I stressed the value of the family automobile as a method of evacuation. Not only does it provide mobility for the family, but these advantages as well: a radio to keep the family informed, a heater for warmth, a luggage compartment for the family's evacuation kit. Yes, not only protection from the weather, but also a measure of protection from radioactive effects. I helped develop on our block a buddy system so that those families with cars, where seats were available, could provide transportation for people without cars. And so, through carpools, by means of buses and other vehicles, our entire neighborhood population could be moved out to highways or to railroad, air, and water terminals. Family instruction also included methods of personal and property decontamination outlined by the radiological defense officials in event of exposure to radioactivity. Also, safety precautions as to time and place. The need for taking shelter if for some reason evacuation did not take place. I described the various types of home shelters recommended by FCDA and the degree of protection that each offered. The basement corner room, the underground masonry shelter, the reinforced concrete underground shelter, the corrugated metal pipe shelter. While stressing the value of the underground shelter, I also emphasized the need for properly stocking the shelter today, not when, but before disaster strikes.
And so, by means of neighborhood meetings as well as individual house calls, block wardens prepare each neighborhood family for evacuation and shelter. But what happens when Conelrad supplements the evacuation alert?
On the alert signal, my warden assistants and I are almost immediately in the street, supplementing the alarm, spurring our neighbors to quick action. Seeing there's transportation for every resident and family, and providing for those whose transportation plans have somehow misfired. It's also our job to help in the evacuation and shelter of the aged and the physically handicapped. In jig time, no more than 10 minutes, the block is nearly vacated of people. But we remain behind to round up transients and stragglers.
Remember Ed Fitzgerald, the country storekeeper who, during the A-bomb era, failed to awaken interest among his rural neighbors in a farm civil defense system? Well, what's he been doing?
Since the H-bomb, there's been a great change in the attitude of our people. Farm civil defense is no longer something to talk about. It's a reality. Today, a common danger joins people in our rural areas with those in our cities. Residual radioactivity, not to mention the hazard of detonation of weapons from aircraft which crash short of the target. Our folks know that, and that's why we get large turnouts at each of our community civil defense meetings. Here, I hammered home the importance of decontamination measures against fallout. Fallout on crops, on animals, as well as on our homes. I emphasize the importance of personal decontamination measures, of dry cleaning or disposing of such clothing, and the need for thorough scrubbing with soap and water after exposure. In short, decontamination to ensure the safety of our farm people, our farm premises, and our farm animals. I described the value of storm cellars as shelters against fallout, giving practically the same protection as an underground shelter in the city. And the use of barns, tool sheds, and other farm buildings as emergency shelters from fallout. In addition, as I stated, we must also take measures to protect our water wells. That was only one phase of my warden duties. In cooperation with the Welfare Service, I had to organize our community, just a 4-hour drive from the city, for the reception of evacuees. Few of my neighbors and I canvassed every home and farm. We surveyed all accommodations available for feeding and housing evacuees. Sharing the peril of city folks, our farm people gave 100% cooperation. As each entry of available primary and secondary housing went into my records, I also noted how long subsistence feeding could be extended. In addition, I noted the shelter capabilities of structures of all types in our area, the amount of shelter that could be diverted to incoming evacuees. As I prepared my plan for utilization of our town facilities and surrounding farms, I was governed first by the needs of our own people if fallout threatened. Secondly, by what facilities we could offer to evacuees from the city.
Back on our city block, our evacuation was well underway. But always in my mind, in addition to danger from H-bomb blast and heat, was the irregular-shaped bomb cloud, saturated with radioactive particles. Not too many miles away was our reception area, the rural community to which we were to guide residents of our block. As part of my warden duties, I had planned assistance to our children, measures to avoid panic on the part of their parents. I had seen that residents of our neighborhood, caught away from home on the evacuation alert, knew what to do. That each of the commercial concerns on our block knew what to do. Then, with the block finally evacuated, lines of cars carrying our people moved through feeder routes out to the boulevard and the main highway into the countryside. Meanwhile, via my car radio, I kept in constant touch with civil defense information sources. Because of news of a fire in a chemical plant on the route ahead, a halt was called to our caravan. Emergency shelter was now desirable for protection against possible attack before movement could be resumed. Shelter facilities such as roadside ravines, gullies, culverts, or as a last resort, an ordinary foxhole dug into the earth, with occupants covered with their coats or newspapers. Later, word came for resumption of our movement toward the reception area. At the reception area, when the cars began to unload, my duties and those of my assistants increased. Seeing, for example, to the care of children, rendering first aid where needed, helping the aged and physically handicapped. Of course, at first, with the arrival of swelling numbers of evacuees, there was confusion. But soon order was restored as the regular welfare services mobilized their forces. Civil defense has encouraged people to take a 3-day food supply in their cars. Meanwhile, it was our job to plan for emergency feeding of our block residents until the welfare services could take over. Even then, we'd still be helping in the welfare services in their overall operation.
So much for Warden Foster. By now, in the reception area, Ed Fitzgerald has reported to the Emergency Welfare Service the estimated number of evacuees able to be cared for by his rural families. Thus, to provide for the care of evacuees, the activities of wardens in both critical and non-critical target areas are integrated, so that families under the care of Warden Foster can be billeted in homes provided by Warden Fitzgerald. But the need for emergency lodgings is so great, quarters at emergency hospitals must be set up in schools, as well as other public buildings. If a subsequent evacuation were necessary due to changing wind conditions, Warden Foster and his assistants must be ready to resume leadership of their group. We must anticipate that all families will not find care in the cities, and some must find subsistence in the open for a short time. Finally, if the duration of the evacuation is such that local facilities cannot meet the needs of evacuees, the warden team must aid block residents in survival techniques. In addition to his other duties, with thousands of vehicles and many more people jamming the reception area, Warden Foster serves as an auxiliary to the police service. And because of the potential increase in the incidence of fires in the reception area, wardens like John Foster volunteer their services when needed to the local fire department. What you have seen is an evacuation drill. But were this an actual attack, it is the warden's responsibility to aid in relocation of his neighbors when their neighborhood has suffered little or no damage. To see that all members of each family perform proper decontamination procedures as instructed by the radiological monitoring teams. To see that front yards, roofs, porches, and all exposed surfaces of the homes on the block are rid of fallout residue. That contaminated water is disposed of in the block's storm sewers. While municipal agencies rid streets and other public areas of the dangerous fallout dust. Thus, the civil defense warden plays a major role, not only in evacuation of his neighborhood, but also in resumption of normal community life, in support areas as well as target area. For where the rural warden's region is endangered, the same techniques of evacuation and relocation apply. Today, in the era of the H-bomb, the American people, as throughout our history, are responding to the threat of a new and powerful form of attack. But a city block or rural area without responsible warden leadership is a neighborhood unprepared for H-bomb disaster. Fortunately, however, through urban and rural America, many thousands of men and women, people like John Foster, Mrs. Coleman, Ed Fitzgerald, who, awake to our modern-day peril, have volunteered to lead their neighbors in evacuation. And so, once again, history repeats its pattern. With the development of the H-bomb, the most potent of all weapons of mankind, followed by the development of a new defensive tactic. Once again, the skeptic stands on the sidelines, advocate of a do-nothing attitude. But he leads a ghost army. For the great majority of our people know the folly of remaining in a target area endangered by H-bomb blast and heat, or an even wider area threatened by fallout. With our cities and rural areas prepared for evacuation, H-bomb attack will not mean the end of our ability to retaliate. But along with our preparations for evacuation, we must also prepare by every American family providing itself with some type of shelter. Remembering that the shelter affording maximum protection is the underground shelter. That next best is the basement shelter, either lean-to or corner room type. And in homes lacking basements, relatively safe areas exist on the first floor. Remembering also that shelter must be taken if caught in the open on the threat of attack. Indeed, with our industrial and urban areas reinforced by the defensive tactics of evacuation and shelter protection, we present a solid front, a strong defense to discourage an enemy from surprise attack, helping to ensure the continuance of peace throughout the world.
The film you have just seen is the story of the development of the Warden Service from World War II through the A-bomb period to the present era of the H-bomb. Civil defense activity is not based on unchangeable concepts, because the very nature of weapons development and changes in weapons delivery systems make it necessary to adopt new methods of procedures, as has occurred in the past. The future, quite likely, will require better systems of shelter and the dispersal of expansions of industry. And the role of warden in civil defense will change accordingly. What will remain unchangeable is the need for family action and neighborhood teamwork under warden leadership. This will point the way to family preparedness and family survival.